Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome back to another Tabletops and Taverns. Now, I only really had one more episode ready for this season, but I think I'm actually going to get this one done, and then do one more, and then the third season is going to be much more structured. For now, though, let's talk about something that I've really always had a little bit of a personal interest in, and that is solo role-playing games, or more specifically, RPGs that allow a single character party. Now, a lot of people who play computer RPGs may already be familiar with the idea. After all, in a game like Skyrim, or the Fallout series, or even some old school games like the original Dragon Quest, or the Ultima Underworld series, you're really only playing your main character, although you may occasionally have henchmen and helpers. Other games may offer full party members, but not require them. So some people may play those games, those party-based computer RPGs, with just one character for a challenge. Now, doing so in a pen and paper setting kind of has its ups and downs, largely because of the bookkeeping time. Many people who would otherwise want to try their hand at solo play might be dissuaded by doing so on tabletop and settle for a roguelike or another computer RPG, and, that is just fine. But some of the very same benefits that you'd see in playing ordinary tabletop RPGs over a computer RPG do carry over to solo play or single player / single DM play, and that's worth looking into. You'll note I'm switching back and forth between referring to solo RPGs or single character parties, and that's because solo RPG can mean a few different things. So before I get too involved with this particular discussion, let's define the various styles of solo play. You can use it to refer to, say, being truly solo with just one player by themselves. You can refer to one player in one game master, or you can use it to define just one player playing off of something that's pre-written. While still using two people, you've still only really got one individual playing the part of the party or the character, so I still consider that solo play. Furthermore, whether you use a GM or not, there's also the matter, and this is aside from that, of how many characters the player controls. Either a one-person party, one player playing a full party, or something in between the two. For purposes of this discussion, although one player playing a full party with one GM is perfectly valid, it really tends to reflect the same sort of experience that a full party with individual players would, except without the social contact. And, I really consider that an entirely separate experience, more closely related to a full party RPG. For our purposes, we're going to discard the multiple characters and focus on either one player and one GM, one player with one character and one GM, or one player alone. Now, I did mention the in-between categorization, and I'll actually touch on that while discussing other combinations of single character types, but just understand that what I mean is that a character can have hirelings and henchmen, animal companions, familiars, long-term summons, that sort of thing. Depending on how deep the system is, it can almost be like running an entire party just with those sorts of sub-characters, but it generally takes a bit longer to set up that party than simply making an entire group of NPCs right off the bat, and often the secondary summons and the secondary companions are much weaker than a full character. So I kind of leave that in its own nebulous area. I'll mention it where it's necessary, but I consider that the same as just playing a single character, except maybe offsetting some of the weaknesses of that. So this leaves us with the true single-player, single-character type setups. Now, just because there's a single person playing the characters doesn't mean there can't be a GM, as I just mentioned, and this is probably the most robust and responsive type of solo play, where one player plays a character in a world pretty much run just like a GM would normally run any other game. This allows the GM to adapt the world and the challenges that the character faces to the specific character in question, and may make for a more survivable game overall, since the GM will be able to take into account the character's strengths and weaknesses, to use them or exploit them where necessary rather than just using a cutout story. Any system can really be used for such a thing. Systems with faster resolution can make for a faster back and forth with a single GM, allowing for much more to be accomplished than with a full party, while a more complex system may allow for a more thorough tactical evaluation of encounters. Arguably, this can apply to the other sorts of solo play that I will also mention, although when you remove the third-party eyes of a GM looking over the situation, then a solo player can start missing certain things in more complex settings. And even at best, it might just devolve into the single player just theory crafting things. So honestly, once you start talking about moving the GM out, it's to the advantage of the player to use a less complex system. Now, other types of solo play are truly solo. The type with the most commercial support is the choose-your-own-adventure style of pre-written adventures or game books. I consider those RPGs. They include things like the Fighting Fantasy and Lone Wolf series, but also the Tunnels and Trolls system, which has long been known for the support of solo adventures. In fact, I've owned it for quite a while. This is, I believe, the 4th edition, and I recently got the new deluxe edition. So it's actually a cute little system to run. Now, what's nice about having, these systems in place is that it gives you a little bit more depth than the classic choose-your-own-adventure books. And they've seen a little bit of a resurgence of reprints and new adventures in recent years. Some of the game books allow for only a specific character, like a specific named character, although others, such as the Tunnels and Trolls and the Fighting Fantasy books, allow for a range of characters within a set of parameters. Now, what's nice about those sorts of game books, oddly enough, is that there's been a conversion of them, of several of the game books, the more popular ones at least, to computer RPGs in recent years. And even when there's not, they usually play quickly on their own. So the downside to that is that since these game books are pre-written, you can only really go through them once. Or really, you can go through them so many times before you've either solved it or you've seen every option. And some of them have multiple solutions, so you can do it more than once, but there is a finite number of times that you can run through the same book. The final type of solo play that I've encountered is randomized play. And basically many game systems provide methods of randomly generating dungeons or entire worlds. AD&D especially had that back in the day. And you can actually use those to play such games without a GM or anything. And I go back to a computer game. I've played the Dungeon Robber Flash game from the Blog of Holding, and that basically takes the randomized dungeons from AD&D 1 and turns it into a solo game style. Now, you can do everything that one does by hand using the old school books, and it is perfectly valid. Furthermore, there is a system, I believe it's called the Mythic system, that functions as a randomized GM, so you can actually use group modules and use the Mythic system to determine what a GM would do without actually having a GM. Now, these kinds of games, using these kinds of things, randomized play especially, is about as close as you can get to a tabletop roguelike as you really, really want. And while they do offer more potential than a computer roguelike, or at least most computer roguelikes, because some of those can get really in-depth, I'm kind of mixed on trying it that way. Now, I do have a few solo campaigns where I've created completely random worlds with completely random dungeons, and I had fun running characters through them. But honestly, I'm not sure if the payoff in terms of creativity and available options is really worth it. Because at the end of the day, if you're doing something that complex, you may as well go with a full group. So having defined the various types of solo play, let's take a look at some of the things you might have to consider while playing pretty much any one of these methods. The pre-written stuff can be a little bit more lenient, but it's not guaranteed. So these sorts of things should be taken into account regardless of whether we're operating with one GM, with a pre-written book, or with a randomized world. You'll quickly find that there's some benefits from a full party that you'll miss when playing with just one character. You basically take them for granted and then they're gone. There's the usual lack of other members to pull your characters out of threatening situations. So any sort of combat, or really any sort of risky situation, can become an all-or-nothing proposition for most solo characters very swiftly. But some other things that players take for granted just may bite a solo character that you don't expect. Just resting, for instance, can be very dangerous solo. Barring things like familiars or the alarm spell, there's no one to keep watch. I mean, there is no way for your character to tell whether somebody's going to sneak up on them. So you either have to rest only when absolutely safe, like bar yourself in a room and make real sure that that door will take a lot of banging to get through, and then that puts you in a sort of walled-off area and you're stuck, or invest in like a watchdog or certain magic items, or as I said, the alarm spell or something similar to accompany you on your travels. Furthermore, carrying capacity can be somewhat limited, meaning that a solo character is going to have to try a little harder to balance what gear they have, what gear they can carry, what loot they could pick up, that sort of thing. Because in a full party, if you've got some things that you might need in a certain situation, but you only need one of, you can delegate that to certain people to carry. Whereas a solo guy, the solo character, they can only carry so much. Available skill pool is going to be strained as well, since you won't have a balanced party to rely on. If you've got a particular skill required to overcome one obstacle and your character doesn't have it, well, they're just out of luck. Now, these are all things that should be considered as a player, but also as a GM or a writer, especially if you're designing adventures for an unknown audience. Adventure design for solo characters is not necessarily more or less challenging than designing one for an entire party, but it shifts your focus, and this is all for the GMs at this point. At least if you want the adventure to be survivable, it should shift your focus. On the one hand, with just one player to deal with, you can often simplify not only the combats themselves, but also things like riddles or other obstacles, just because there's only one player to deal with. Either a puzzle will click or it won't, and without having a whole range of different skills to approach these obstacles, the player's tactics are going to be limited to just what they can accomplish with that one character. So instead of designing complexity in terms of entire room traps and such, you can still throw in a room trap or a room puzzle in there, but you don't have to worry about having multiple people come at it, that sort of thing. Now, on the other hand, a single player or single character party is more susceptible to being overwhelmed by things that you ordinarily wouldn't consider overwhelming. And by this I mean with actions or with things going on. In a lot of systems, actions are more important than hit points, attack damage, etc. Take a set of encounters that have roughly equivalent challenge. One is a large, single creature, such as a bugbear or something, that hits real hard, while the other is a number of smaller creatures, such as kobolds or goblins or the like, that hit not for a lot, but each one has an attack. They may, by the book, be about as challenging as one another, but a solo character will probably have an easier time with the bugbear, simply because multiple smaller kobolds, goblins, and that like, they'll all be getting their own shots in, while the bugbear will only be getting its own set of attacks once per round. Some of the better systems designed for solo play actually take this into account. For instance, the aforementioned Tunnels and Trolls often has a monster rating value that abstracts one or sometimes entire groups of creatures into a single pool of numbers that represents all of them. Fighting Fantasy, if I remember right, has similar systems to limit things, although I don't think they go the route that Tunnels and Trolls do. I think they just limit the amount of monsters that can engage a character at one time. Not 100% on that. I'll have to check that out. And I've recently checked out that system too. Anyway, I'm getting distracted here. If it's not built into the system, then you will have to consider it in your encounter balance as you're designing it. Now, this doesn't mean you have to eliminate large groups of creatures entirely. Multiple small creatures, for instance, can be used as a sort of scaled encounter meant to eat up area of effects type spells or multiple target abilities that the individual character may have, so that the overall damage exchange can be brought under control quickly. So you can set them up purely to eat up those AEs. Other considerations for design are how to handle situations like the aforementioned need to rest, as well as threats that may end up being game-ending in a situation that a group could ordinarily survive easily. Being defeated in combat or failing to cross a chasm, for instance, may not necessarily always result in a character's death, but rather provide opportunity for a branch in the story. A character who is defeated, for instance, may be captured instead of killed, and present an entire subplot of attempting to escape and get back to freedom, while a character that fails a critical jump might, instead of finding themselves just splatted at the bottom of a cliff, actually falling into a raging river only to be swept far away from where they intended, bruised and battered, but alive. This isn't to say that you can't have some instances where the character just actually dies, boop, and then the game ends and you start anew. After all, without risk, why bother playing in the first place? But the player should never be able to tell, at least not with absolute certainty, whether a failure would result in something that is recoverable or something that's pretty permanent. They should never know before they take that jump whether a failure is going to drop them onto shattered rocks below or something that they can get away with. Now, something that I do when designing games for a solo game is to take into account an individual known character's strengths and weaknesses. This can be done in a one-player with GM setting or with a pre-written choose-your-own-adventure style adventure if you're writing one of those, so long as you limit the unknown player's character choices. You know, with a one player in one GM setting, you're designing stuff on the fly, that's not a problem. If you're designing stuff for an unknown player, yeah, you're going to want to limit their settings to what you can deal with. A lot of the old school Tunnels and Trolls books, for instance, tended to limit character choices to just like a warrior or a similar subset of the classes, often with a limited power range. For a solo player using a randomized world, well, it doesn't really come into play. That doesn't come into play at all in a randomized game, like a roguelike game. Of course, playing to a character's strengths and weaknesses doesn't mean that every challenge should be focused on a character's strengths. Sometimes you'll want to offer an option that a character may consider, even if it focuses on an ability that is not their top ability. Especially if you make some sort of obvious time-saving or visible reward available for risking it. So you can kind of tempt them into using their off stats. So the player will have to decide whether they want to take that greater risk for potentially greater reward, or whether they want to back off and just stay with what their character's good at. So given the differences between a solo run versus a group run, why would anybody even consider a solo run, especially when you've got computer RPGs out there? Well, for a player, a solo run can be pretty rewarding. First, there's the accessibility. For a solo game with no GM, you can literally play it whenever you have time to, whether this be running through a pre-written solo adventure or randomizing one using some sort of generator. Even if you have a GM that you want to meet up with, it's often a lot easier to get just two people together for a few hours than to schedule several people to sit down around a table. Then there's the satisfaction of the challenge itself. Facing something alone and overcoming it can be a test of luck or player skill, in a dice system at least, or a test of insight in something like a pre-written adventure. Regardless, coming out on top without anybody to back you up can be quite a thrill. Further, since usually play is faster with only one person and one GM, and usually there's less distractions in that, it gives the players a chance to try out a number of character types that they may not have had a chance to in a slower, weekly game with multiple people. I know for myself, for instance, since I GM so much, I rarely get to try out even a quarter of the character types I'd like to as an actual player, and when given the opportunity to play one-on-one, I will jump on it. From a game master standpoint, running a solo game can allow you to learn the intricacies of balancing challenges against particular classes on an individual basis, as well as giving you a test bed for potential riddles and puzzles that you intend to use in larger games. Furthermore, the swiftness of just getting through a bunch of solo games means that you may well have the opportunity to tell stories that you would not have been able to do so otherwise, as well as focus on areas of a game world where a particular group may not wish to go. You can use solo play to rapidly flesh out entire areas of a campaign or its history in preparation for another group to run proper group adventures on, as well as to practice thinking on your feet, which is an important skill for a group thing, but becomes especially important when you're dealing with one-on-one with one player, because that player is going to make a snap decision without having to consult a bunch of people, and then you'll have to immediately respond. So playing solo RPGs is kind of out of place as it seems in this day and age. Is still viable, and it still has a point. Whether it just be one player and a GM or one player alone, it does give an opportunity to experience the game and provide some amusement. There's other means of playing solo games I haven't really covered here, and one product that I'd like to see is a streamlined solo RPG that has a built-in dungeon generation system that supports long-term play. Now, I have seen a few simplified solo RPG mechanics and solo RPGs produced online. I might mention the Solo Hack, for instance, but many of these are extremely streamlined and designed only for small subsets of character advancement. Still, a lot of systems can actually support solo play and should not be overlooked. Now, I mentioned I'd talk about companions and followers and things like familiars and such in terms of like a half character kind of party. What those do, and this is important because if your system allows such things, they can greatly alleviate a lot of the weaknesses in terms of running a solo character. I know that, for instance, in the Pathfinder game, you can actually run entire group-based modules and group-based adventures for particular character classes that get a lot of companions and a lot of summons. For instance, the Master Summoner was named as one that could solo a lot of content simply because once you get enough, not full characters, but enough companions, enough summons, then they can start filling in the action gap and make encounters more readily accessible. So that is something to consider. If you want to run, especially with a one GM versus one player thing, if that one player has a summoner or like a necromancer or something that can produce a lot of pets, like a druid or something, and you're the GM, you can actually start throwing stuff that would be more appropriate for a full group of characters at them, and they may come out of it pretty good, and that'll give you some chances to try some of those out, even though you're only dealing with one player, and you'll get through it a lot faster because, as I said, it's only one player calling the shots, and they'll be able to provide snap decisions on what they do. Anyway, I think I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. This has been the RPG Crawler. Let me know what you think about solo or at least one-on-one roleplay. And if you like this, if you like it, go ahead and leave a like. Comment if you've got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. If you'd like to help support this channel and see more of these videos, go ahead and check out my Patreon at patreon.com/RPGcrawler. Until next time, take care and goodbye.